Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us here this evening. Sue, you said, where were you in 1990? I was in school, and I didn't imagine that I would be here in Davos having a conversation with you and Bill. But it's an important conversation to have. I've met with Bill previously, and the last chat we had was around investing in human capital and why that was an imperative, especially for developing and emerging economies. Healthcare, education, these things matter. And the reason why it's important to have this conversation here in Davos is because a lot of these global institutions that are looking at the healthcare needs require funding, require that replenishing of funding, and it's important to take the message across. The experience over the last 2 decades clearly shows that, as the video told us, progress is possible, but it is not inevitable. We shouldn't take it for granted. So to talk about the experience and to talk about the challenges and what needs to be done going forward, I'm going to invite Bill and Sue to jump in on the conversation. And Bill, since we're in Davos, it's only appropriate that I ask you this because the criticism of Davos is that there's a lot of talk and not enough action. But, Gavi and Global Fund, it came together here in Davos, didn't it?
Absolutely. The Davos meeting is where Gavi was announced to the world. And within the next year, then the Global Fund also got created. And whenever you have panels here, you talk, okay, what can we do in the next 2 or 3 years? People are very impatient. But when it comes to redoing health systems, getting new products out there, it takes a lot longer. The great things that happen over 20 years, in a way, people don't pay that much attention to them because they're so focused on the here and now and what can be done in the near term. But in the case of global health, we really do need to take this kind of 20-year time frame and say, okay, what have we achieved? And if we keep investing, what does that set us up for during the next 20 years?
And I know you're all about data and you love to talk about what the experience has been in the last 20 years, so we'll bring up that slide as well. But this is an issue that requires collaboration between governments and the private sector. Take me through the challenges over the last 20 years, the experience, and where you see the road ahead.
Okay, yeah, let me just describe this wonderful death chart, because there's a lot of deaths and a lot of information up there. What it does on your left-hand side, you have the bars indicating the death by 5-year age group in 1990. And then over on the other side, you have the equivalent data updated to 2017. And what you'll see is that people in their first 5 years are incredibly vulnerable compared to the next year. So you have more than a factor of 10 drop between 0 to 5 versus those other youth ages. That is, by the time you get fully developed, your immune system, you can withstand quite a bit. Another thing that's up there is that the red bar, the red colored part of the bar, are the deaths, the portion of the deaths that are in the low and low middle income countries. And then the orange is the rest of the countries, the high and upper middle income countries. And so you'll see that particularly into 0 to 5, the red part is dramatically larger than the orange part. And that's the vulnerability of young children in developing countries. In a rich country, only 1% of children die. In many places in the world, we still have 15 to 20% deaths. In total, the deaths during this period went down from 12 million a year to under 6 million a year. And the health initiatives that we're talking about, there's 2 we're mostly highlighting, but we also include the polio work and now this global finance facility that's part of the World Bank. A significant part of the credit goes to the bed nets, the vaccines, the interventions that were orchestrated starting here 20 years ago. And I remember those meetings where we said, hey, what can we get done by 1995? And some ambitious goals were set that were not actually achieved, but they pushed us in the right direction. Only now can we say that getting ARV medicine out, getting bed nets out, really did change the course of the infection. They didn't end it. Now, we'll have a chart later to show what's left to be done. But we're in a different, very much a different situation today. The total money that was put in to these funds over this time period is around $100 billion. So per life saved, that's not much. By some standards, it is a lot. Our foundation had a chance to be part of that. We were about 10%, a bit over $10 billion. And we feel it's as good an investment as we've ever made, compared to anything I've done. It's as good an investment ever.
I just want to pick up on the point that you made on the new tools, and I'll get to innovation in just a second. But what's been the experience on the delivery side, especially with technology now being used by a lot of emerging economies as well to try and address the delivery system and the delivery needs? What's been the big change and the big shift that you've seen there?
Well, if you get out into rural areas, you want to take the integrated primary health care system and piggyback that to deliver these tools. Most people who live in rural Africa will be born and die without ever meeting a doctor. And so it's a very different image of what healthcare is than you might have in the West. In the urban areas, the delivery had to be done because of just the numbers involved in a fairly specialized way. So, if you go to Cape Town or Johannesburg, you'll see there's a special HIV treatment center that's been done there, and that makes a lot of sense because you want specialized employment just to get maximal efficiency. There's been a lot of learning, like MSF does a thing where you bring somebody with you when they tell you about your ARV medicines, and that person is there to help remind you on a regular basis. Some of the early predictions that adherence to taking the medicines would be very low. Fortunately, those doubts were well-founded. It hadn't been proven that this could be done. I remember the very first clinics we did in Botswana, we probably over-designed them, a little gold-plated, too many doctors involved in all the decisions. But over time, there's been a lot of streamlining. There's been this integration, really taking the country and saying, okay, what is your plan? The Global Fund countries come and present a plan. Gavi countries come in and present an application to say we want to roll out this new vaccine. So these 20 years, I'm not suggesting that what we had in year one in terms of how we worked with the private sector, how we made sure the money wasn't diverted in a few cases, particularly the training. That was a real weak point. We had to shore that up. And this idea of delivering the cooperation with the standard healthcare. There have been tons of lessons during this 20 years. So both the two early organizations are now pretty far down the learning curve and are doing things in a much, much better way. And that's actually informing the tools we want. With the bed net, they tear a lot. Okay, let's be willing to pay a little bit extra to get a bed net we have this durability test now. It sounds pretty basic. But when we just did low price and we didn't select out for durability, we had some of the bed nets that even within a year and a half, weren't performing their function.
Sue, I want to pick up on the innovation issue. The interventions from the past that have worked, and what more needs to be done to be able to get the tools that Bill was talking about now, as you see the needs?
Well, let me just mention a couple areas where I think the creation of Global Fund and Gavi have made a massive impact in a positive way on innovation. The first is at universities. University faculty and students are so inspired by global health, but they need funding. So the fact that there is interest, that there is funding, and that there is a delivery mechanism for global health has made a massive difference in young people and existing professors and faculty members getting excited about global health. And that's been a transformation. I think that's a really exciting part of this story, is that some of the most talented people in academia can go down that path. Now, we're advocates for governments and science funders funding global health R&D because we need that talent to apply their brain power to the tools we need. The other thing that we've been really inspired by, and as part of my background, is pharma and biotech. Mm-hmm. So things like HIV, TB, malaria, and vaccines too often can be called market failures. A market failure means that if you're looking at your P&L, your profit and loss, you don't see a market, you don't see that there will be a customer for that. So these mechanisms allow for people to see that their products will be used, mm-hmm. that there can be a market, and we have a lot of different tools to drive that innovation. So we don't work with the private sector for a specific affinity for private sector. We want governments involved, we want academia involved, and we want the private sector to understand that the talent, the passion, that the employee enthusiasm all follow with looking at these tools, and the tools can get to the people who need them the most. Mm-hmm. And so particularly in things like vaccines, both diagnostics and therapeutics for HIV, TB, and malaria, this is an area we continue to be extremely interested in. But the fact that they can get to the people who need them the most is inspiring to everyone.
But what about the dialogue with governments across the world? And I ask you this question in the context of what we're seeing with countries like the US, for instance, and we'll talk about France in just a second because that's going to be crucial in terms of replenishing the fund needs. But the conversation with governments about investing in human capital, I mean, I'll use India as an example, and you've advocated the need for more government spending on healthcare in India for a long time now. We now have the rollout of an insurance scheme, and it's done 100 days. We have to see how it plays out. But out-of-pocket expenses on healthcare for a country like India, 3 times the global average. So what's the conversation with policymakers like?
Yeah, so this slide is another one I like a lot. It shows the deaths caused, we picked HIV, malaria, and measles deaths. And what you can see is that both HIV and malaria were at an all-time high in the early 2000s. ARVs had been invented, but they were not rolled out to the poorest countries. So as we got through up to 2010, we finally started to bend the curve. That's when the malaria bed nets started going out. That's also when we did a lot of measles campaigns and got coverage up. So you can see we bent the curve. We're not at zero. The sum of those deaths is about 1.6 million still. So, that's the work of the next 20 years, is to get that number near zero. Now, referring to the governments, if you look at the funding, there's 2 things you can take out of that chart. It's the billions of the aid money. Aid money in total from the rich countries is about $130 billion a year. Of that, about 10% goes to global health issues. What you see is that it was when these groups got the funding that we were able to bend that curve. And so it's pretty phenomenal. You go from about $8 billion up to about $33 billion total in this spending, but you can tell over these last 6 or 7 years that's plateaued. Now, that's a challenge. It means per person on HIV treatment, we have to be a lot more efficient. Per bed net, we have growing populations, we have drug resistance, we have lots of headwinds where if we would prefer to have that upwards curve continuing at this point. So it's way, way better than it dropping down a lot. But we need to push it up. And the pragmatics of, can we get the level of attention given all the other priorities in the world? Here we're saving lives for very little money. It's very dramatic, and if we don't stay the course, the diseases come back pretty dramatically if you don't suppress them with the preventative tools. So we'd like to see an increase. And, we're going to the governments and saying, despite all your priorities, we're asking for less than 1% of your budget to come and stay the course on these advances.
And what is the response?
Well, the next year will be exciting. I think Peter Sands is going to talk about the schedule for Global Fund and the goal that they've set. Within 6 months of that event, the Gavi, Seth Berkley and his team will gather somewhere in the world, and it'll be a super open thing. Our countries maintaining and increasing what they've been willing to give to these things, and so that's partly why it's such a big part of our message here. Is these things are very successful. They haven't been without challenges that we've had to deal with, but boy, these are learning organizations. The challenges we face in the future, we've got great teams that are going to be very responsive to whatever's needed.
Don't pay heed to the message that we're sending out from here. And if there is a fall in development assistance, what's Plan B?
Well, we didn't we have another slide, which is kind of a depressing slide, that we showed in New York, which is if you cut HIV funding only about 15%, then you get millions of additional lives lost. Right now, I'd have to say I'm optimistic. I think the main question for us is, can we get the increase that we want? I don't see a situation, of course, times are tumultuous, and there are many things going on I would have not predicted in the world right now.
For instance.
So,
don't answer that
Come on, Sue.
But right now, my guess is that we will definitely, in both cases, be able to raise what we've raised before, but we need increases like 15 to 20% type increases, because as we talk to the countries about what they need, with the newer bed nets, with the increased population, now we're smarter about reaching out to young women and helping get behavior change that makes them be less at risk. There's a lot of good ideas that are coming in to basically drive that number down even more. So I don't know what the level of increase will be. We live this world and we know how valuable this is, but the noise level and the ability to really get this message across, partly the reason we have this group here tonight is to arm you with the set of facts so that you can be going out there and reminding people that amongst all the priorities governments have, this is one that really has delivered.
Well, so, this chart doesn't actually talk about what is happening on the private sector side, what's happening as far as foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is concerned. Give me a sense of getting that dialogue and that conversation going forward. The fact that we might see governments cut back, you will probably need more from the private sector to offset that.
So let me start by just reinforcing something that Bill said that I want to make sure is really clear. That philanthropy and the private sector will never step in the shoes of government. Yeah. I mean, we are massively dependent on government to fund this. So let me start there. I can't say that enough. And so thought leaders in this room can influence that. I mean, the governments care what its citizens think about where they invest the funds that they get from tax dollars. We hope. I'm with you. But now let me speak about two other parts of this that you're asking about. So I often tell people, as CEO of the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda are my bosses. And they have high expectations. We have a lot on our plate. So one of my jobs at the Gates Foundation is to assist Bill and Melinda in allocating our resources. So I start on the philanthropy side of things by making sure that other philanthropists know that even though we're ambitious very broadly, we do a lot of things at the Gates Foundation, these two causes are extremely high on our priority list. Bill talked about 10 billion. We have put $10 billion against this. We didn't put $10 billion against this for any reason that comes from the heart. I mean, the heart speaks to you, but if you're voting with your head, this is a great return on investment. So we're allocating our capital to these causes because we think it's a great return on investment. And I would want philanthropists in the audience to know that, or private industry to know this is a great ROI. And so I think that is one way to counteract some of the criticism of philanthropy when you see something that's matured and that works. And if you care about equity and global health, these are two best bets.
You know, speaking of this ROI, and do you get a sense that governments are now starting to get it, Bill? This business of investing in human capital?
Well, the World Bank has been great over the last year talking about human capital, that is the improving the health and education, particularly of the young people, as the key predictor of how well a country will do, including will it grow its economy in such a way that it becomes self-sufficient and graduates from aid. And, you know, as countries do better, they get less money. In some cases, they completely graduate from being recipients because they've developed to the point they are able to use their domestic resources. So, yes, that human capital message, it's not an easy thing to fix overnight. You don't say, oh, I'm going to, you know, get all my kids educated, you know, overnight. You've got to really build up a system, and but you know, the long term is where the high impact can come on that. So yes, I think there's an understanding that health is a big component of that, education's a component of that, and that we should help these countries get to their to that self-sufficiency.
You know, we've spoken a lot that we have reason to be hopeful for, and the experience shows us, the data shows us that a lot has worked. But is there anything specific at this point in time, Bill, in terms of the demographics that give you cause for concern, that require this message to go out loud and clear?
Well, definitely the age group that is most susceptible, 0 to 5 in the case of the infectious diseases, and 15 to 24 in the case of HIV, the continent that's got the huge population growth is where most of these cases are. And so the challenge of prevention is gigantic. And that's why it showed that if we cut back on the money spent here, you really get even a non-linear escalation in the number of deaths. Here, actually, this slide, this is our last slide, so study this one carefully. I also like this one because I think if you ask somebody to guess at this one, to try and draw it before you showed it to them, they would make significant mistakes. Most people think the number of births, total births in the world, is still going up. It's not going up. All of the population increase that we have globally comes because people are living longer. Any of you who've read Hans Rosing's stuff will know that because he's so articulate about it. But there is a gigantic mix shift taking place underneath the largely plateaued, slightly declining total number of births in the world. And that is that the sub-Saharan Africa, which in terms of population, is only about 12% of the world, is over already almost a quarter of the births. And as you go towards the end of the century, it grows to be nearly half of all the births, which is kind of amazing that and here we just took sub-Saharan Africa. We didn't include Northern Africa. So that's where the poorest and most vulnerable are, and that sort of outlines why this is a big challenge.
I'll end by asking you, what's the one thing that you're most hopeful of and the one thing that concerns you the most?
Well, these causes can feel very far away, and when there's a lot of pressing domestic concerns. So it's do we do a good job of staying on the agenda? The thing I'm most hopeful for is that we'll use these incredible organizations and hand them wonderful new tools that will allow them to bend the curve even more than what has already been done.
Well, Bill Gates and Sue, thank you very much for your time this evening. We wish you the very best of luck. And Peter Sands, we wish you the very best of luck as well. Thank you very much for joining us here this evening. Well, we're in the midst of a bitter corporate battle back in India, and joining us now to discuss the implications for ArcelorMittal's bid for Essar Steel is Aditya Mittal. Aditya, I appreciate you joining us. As I said, you're not a stranger to bitter battles. We've seen one play out a little more than a decade ago for Arcelor. It took 5.5 months to wrap that up. What's your own sense of how things are panning out? Do you think that the IBC process is being frustrated by some individuals?
Shreen, that's a great question. Look, our focus is value maximization through a rule-based process. I think that's what we followed. The process of Essar Steel has taken a bit longer than we all anticipated. The IBC suggests 270 days for the whole process to be wrapped up. It's been about 540 days. But I think we're coming to a good conclusion. There was a judgment this morning as well at the appellate court requesting Ahmedabad court to hurry up.
By the 31st of January?
Yeah, exactly. So that's not too long ago. That's not too far away.
But do you think that, this NCLT and NCLAT is the first installment? The real battle is going to play out in the Supreme Court. Are you prepared for that?
So we've been to Supreme Court, right? We went to Supreme Court back in September.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court passed a judgment. And we complied with the judgment. And as a result, the COC took a decision and the process has moved on. I think the Supreme Court heard the case. They went through it in a lot of detail. So the Supreme Court is very aware of what this process is about. So going back to Supreme Court, I think the judgment will be repeated. So for us, it's not a matter of concern.
Let me ask you about whether you were surprised about State Bank of India's decision to put that 15,500 crores of the Essar Steel exposure on the block. Of course, the deadline for that has now been extended. How do you see that playing out and what the implications could be on the IBC process?
I think that's another demonstration why the process needs to come to a logical conclusion and a speedy conclusion, right? The state banks are losing 17 crores a day. Okay, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money for India. They can utilize those funds, redeploy it to enhance liquidity in the country, redeploy it, give loans, and boost growth. Yet instead, because of all of these actions and delay tactics, they're requesting bids at an 18% discount to our offer, right? 18% discount. That's a lot of money that's being put on the table. And that's why it's very important that the court processes and the rule-based IBC is implemented, because otherwise, in the big picture, the country is losing a lot of value.
You talked about value maximization, and I go back to the statement that came in from Essar Steel saying that their offer is in line with the objective of the IBC to enhance value maximization, not just for lenders, but also for operational creditors, and their offer is better than the resolution plan that was cleared, 12,000 crore rupees better. How do you respond to that?
So that's very interesting because when you read the media reports, the first offer that they made was 20,000 crores, right? So if it wasn't for our...
Now in excess of 54,000
No, but if you go back to day one, it was 20,000 crores, right?
But now I'm talking about the revised offer.
So let's talk about the revised offer. You have to follow a rule-based process, and that's what my answer was going to be. Because if you do not follow a rule-based process, companies like us and others will not participate as a promoter bidding for a company. Then what you would have seen is that Essar Steel would have been sold to New Metal/Ruyas for 20,000 crores. That would have been a massive loss. And then future bad loans, future companies which are not able to service the debt, the promoters would come back and buy it back at a discount because the Essar Steel would demonstrate that you don't have to follow the rules. So it's not just about our case.
So you believe that this is a subversion of the IBC?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Because the IBC process was very clear. The courts were very clear. There were chances to submit bids. I mean, we all know this is not a process we started yesterday, right? It's almost 2 years. And so now suddenly the COC has decided, they've chose the winning bid. to come in at the last moment. I mean, I don't even think the bid is financed. There's no guarantees. There's no penalties, because in the IBC process you provide guarantees. If you forfeit your bid, all of those things are there. So it's an unfortunate development, and clearly the courts will take the right decision. I have a lot of faith in a rule-based economy as India, and that should be the logical conclusion.
That's the point of view of Essar, but that point of view has also been bolstered by somebody like Sajjan Jindal, also perhaps an interested party in some senses, or at least was in the previous avatar of the bid with New Metal. What do you make of Sajjan Jindal saying that, look, the Essar family should get the right to go through with this if they can finance it?
Look, I think all promoters have the right to buy back their companies by paying back 100 cents on the dollar, but not 540 days later, right? They should, first of all, not allow the company to go under, right? That's the first requirement. And if the company has gone under, try and find a solution as soon as you can. First submit a bid of 20,000 and then mess around with the process, I don't think is a promoter trying to act in the best interest of creditors.
Is there a possibility at all, and we saw this play out as far as Arcelor is concerned, that there was a last-minute sweetening of the offer? Is that a possibility that you would consider, given the fact that Essar continues to bring up the fact that there is a 12,000 crore rupee difference between what they're offering and your offer?
Look, I think we've gone through 540 days. I think what the banks are really focused on is coming to the right conclusion.
But is this even a possibility, a revised offer on your part?
There's no need, right? The COC has taken a decision. We're in the courts to approve the resolution plan. So at this point in time, I think our bid, if you just looked at the scoring when the bids were open, was far in excess of anything on the table. And today the banks are willing to sell at a discount to our bid. So I think the discussion is not about the bid. The discussion is really about
the
process, making sure that the employees of Essar Steel have a clear future, making sure that we can make the investments, improve the business, grow the business, and bring in our capabilities to India.
Your plans for India rest on what finally happens as far as Essar Steel is concerned. But that's also sort of put a spanner in the works for your other plans. For instance, with the agreement with SAIL, and I again point out, if the process were not to go through as per your expectations, what happens to ArcelorMittal's plans for India?
So SAIL is not linked to Essar Steel.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
Yeah, I'm talking about your plans for India, outside of Essar Steel, if this were not to go through.
So that's not a possibility as far as I'm concerned.
You're not even willing to look at that possibility.
Look, I believe that India is a rule-based economy, and that is why the country will continue to develop and progress. And if you look at the rules are very simple. The IBC process is designed to maximize value within the rules of the process, and that's what we have followed.
But on that SAIL agreement, is the definitive agreement anywhere close to being inked?
So the whole team and all of us have been very focused on Essar Steel. So we need to arrive at the end conclusion of that process, and then obviously we're going to turn our energies to SAIL.
You keep stressing on the fact that instead of 180 days, it's already been 540 days. We should hear from the NCLT by the 31st of January, and then the NCLAT perhaps sometime in February. What's the timeline that you're now working with? And again, I mean, the possibility of going back to the Supreme Court is a valid one.
I think the timeline that everyone is working towards is to complete it in this fiscal year, Indian fiscal year, which is end of March.
If it does go through, and it goes through in your favor, which you absolutely believe it will, and you feel certain that it will, what next then as far as Essar Steel is concerned, your plans for the company?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's really what I want to talk about. So first of all, at ArcelorMittal we pride in terms of safety culture, safety performance. Even though we're about 6% of the global steel production, 2/3, according to WSA, World Steel Association, 2/3 of the world's safest sites are ArcelorMittal facilities. So clearly we want to bring safety practices. Essar already does a great job, but I think we can bring some capability there. We also want to have a positive impact on the environment. We think we have very strong environmental practices, and we can implement that. The third area that we want to focus on is some of the capex has not been spent. Over time because of all the financial difficulties. So we want to accelerate and spend that capex. That includes completing a pelletizer, a coke battery, making sure Hazira achieves its design capacity. You see, Hazira is an 8.5 million ton facility today, and it's not shipping that amount of steel. So that's the first order of business: safety, health, environment, completing the capex, making sure Hazira achieves design capacity. The next order of business is looking at growth. So we believe we have expansion possibility at Hazira, right? We can take Hazira to up to 12.5 million tons. So that's very exciting, how to plan that growth. We also have to examine changes in its technology. Because as you know, Hazira has been very gas dependent, which has been one of its weaknesses. And we want to bring in blast furnace technology and coke making capability so its gas dependence reduces. And that will improve its cost performance. So in the future, it should not enter into compressed margins when the steel industry goes down because gas prices are not linked to the steel business. And then we would also look at the East Coast assets. You see, the Eastern Coast assets, if you look at Paradeep has good potential. And we could examine setting up a greenfield facility in Paradeep. So for us, the acquisition of Essar is very exciting. It's a great steel asset. You have to give credit to the Ruyas and the family for building such a facility. It's a coastal site. It's a large-scale site. It has 2 sites on the East Coast, which are also coastal, 2 pellet plants, 2 pipelines, 2 pelletizers, 8.5 million ton design capacity. So a lot of credit for building something like that in the Indian context. But clearly there's an opportunity to take it forward, and that's what we're interested in.
So, you talked about the plans that you have for Essar Steel as and when this transaction is concluded in your favor. What kind of investments are we talking about additionally?
So we have not publicly disclosed the level of investments, but I think you can
give me some sense.
Yeah, it's at least a few $1 billion of investment, both in terms of catch-up capex as well as fixing the gas issues and achieving design capability at Hazira and taking it beyond that.
So if this were to get done by the first half of this year, and you hope that at least as far as the court process is concerned, March 31st, that's exactly what I said. How soon, will you be able to sort of take over and get things going as and when the deal is done?
So normally it's very fast, right? We have all the approvals. We have competition approvals. We have the facilities. We have the money. I saw that when Tata got the approval from the courts on Bhushan Steel, they closed it within 3 days. So I think the whole thing will move very fast. We also have Indian competition approval, right? We have CCI approval. And so I expect it to be closed within days of the court finally approving our resolution plan. We have our team ready. It's a joint venture with Nippon Steel. Nippon Steel is another great steel company, largest in Japan, among the largest steel companies in the world. And together we can bring and enhance all the strategic plans I spoke about. So we can bring value-added technology to the country. We can bring automotive products and solutions for the growing automotive industry. We can provide further solutions in terms of the construction segment. And we should not lose focus that we can also provide capability on how to have a minimized carbon footprint as that becomes a bigger and bigger issue as climate change is upon us now.
Has there been any conversation with the Ruyas over the last 40 days on this matter at all?
India is a very small country at the end of the day, right?
Maybe not directly, but indirectly?
No, I think, look, we're always talking. I know the family very well. As I said earlier on, I think it's very impressive what they have built. I think now there's a chance of someone else to come in and take it to the next level.
If things were not to go your way, would it be the end of the story and the end of the road as far as your plans for India are concerned?
Look, it can never be the end, right?
Greenfield assets, I mean, you've been trying for very, very long.
Look, from our perspective, and I'm at the risk of repeating myself, but clearly we have followed the rules. The country will flourish and develop if the rules are followed. That's how you take a developing country into a developed country, right? If you can't have a rule-based economy, it's very hard for investors both within the country and outside the country to invest. And so that's our basis. And so I don't think there's any reason to speculate on what happens if we don't succeed. I think
there is no plan B.
There is no plan B. We're going to succeed.
Well, Aditya, always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us on CNBC TV 18. And best of luck.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time here.
All right.
Well, that's Aditya
Thank you.
Mittal talking about...